Anyway, welcome to the third in this series of discussions and lectures about the Jewish exile entitled By the Waters of Babylon. Today we're going to try to cover some major changes that happened to Judaism during the exile. Looking over the material I have, it came to about 7 hours, so I had to do some cutting. I see Ken recognizing this situation. So unless we want to stay until 2 o'clock tomorrow morning, I think we'll try to keep this down to about an hour's discussion.
All right. Well, we'll have to suffer through.
So anyway, let's talk about what happened during the exile. I think where we broke off last time, we were talking about there have been a number of major changes that occurred in Judaism, and one of which was simply reinventing the past, which was done through the actually begun before the exile, and the books of the Hebrew epic come from the period before the exile. Also, the book of Deuteronomy, which redefined a number of the ritualistic and cultic elements of Judaism. So today I want to talk a little bit more about some of the cultic parts of it, but also talk about the renewal of the covenant, which I think is the major change that takes place in Judaism. Everybody can still hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Well, as we said last time, there are probably about 9 major areas in which we could distinguish Judaism from other religions of the area. And very simply, those were the covenant, monotheism, belief in a single God, worship in the temple, the Torah, dietary laws, codes of purity, the rite of circumcision, annual festivals, and the Sabbath. Now, some of those undergo very minor changes, if any at all. The ritual of circumcision does not seem to have been affected. The festivals are an interesting issue because we don't really know, did they still keep the festivals in Babylon, or did that just fall into disuse until the return from the exile? The dietary laws are something you just take with you, and so they were apparently not affected much at all, and the purity code's the same way. Now, we have mentioned that there are some... Oops, I just lost something here.
Is there any way that we can help you?
No, I think I'm on the right thing now. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit about, well, the Torah we talked about last time, the fact that the Torah at the beginning of this period is basically just a very loose collection of scrolls. There is no unified narrative, and it consists of various prophets and early traditions and some psalms and so forth. During the exile period, a period of about 100, and the period before and after, a period of about 120 to 130 years, about 2/3 of what we now know as the Bible was either composed or revised, basically. So a big change that takes place within Judaism is, I think, the overarching theme of this is that the Torah becomes the center of the religion as opposed to the temple. And in that transition, the role of scribes and rabbis is very definitely a part of that movement. The scribes and the rabbis become the custodians of the Torah, and so The Torah then becomes the focus of a great deal of Jewish religious life as opposed to the temple. Now, the focus of worship before the exile had been the temple in Jerusalem. The temple's gone. So what do you do? One possibility would be to build local temples in Babylon. We have absolutely no evidence that that happened. There may have been just too much tradition in favor of the Jerusalem temple that said you just can't do that. Anyway, we do know that in a later period, some of the Egyptian Jews did build their own temples, at least one of which we have some remains of, but no sign of this in Babylon. So what do you do if you don't have a temple? Well, a couple of things occur, one of which is certainly the development of, if not called the synagogue, at least something similar to that. I want to step back just a moment and take a look at the priesthood, which were the priests, after all, were the people that kept the temple worship going. And we know from the Hebrew scriptures that there were at least three different sets of priests. This gets extremely complicated and messy. The Aaronic priesthood, the Zadokite priesthood, and the Levites. The Levites were one of the original 12 tribes of Israel, but they were a tribe that had no property and no homeland, so to speak, and they were therefore to serve as the religious leaders. Now, something happened. Let me make one change here in my notes. I see this is not working right. Sorry about that. Okay. There is an interesting passage in the book of Ezekiel, and I'm just going to read it. The Levites who went far from me when Israel went astray and who wandered from me after their idols must bear the consequences of their sin. They may serve in my sanctuary, having charge of the gates of the temple and serving in it. They may slaughter the burnt offerings and sacrifices for the people and stand before the people and serve them. But because they served them in the presence of their idols and made the people of Israel fall into sin, therefore I have sworn with uplifted hand that they must bear the consequences of their sin, declares the sovereign Lord. They are not to come near to serve me as priests or to come near any of my holy things or my most holy offerings. They must bear the shame of their detestable practices, and I will appoint them to guard the temple for all the work that is to be done in it. But the Levitical priests, or descendants of Zadok, the Zadokites, and who guarded my sanctuary when the Israelites went astray from me, are to come near to minister before me. They are to stand before me to offer sacrifices of fat and blood, declares the sovereign Lord. They alone are to enter my sanctuary. They alone are to come near my table to minister before me and serve me as guards. So we have, at least according to Ezekiel, we have a division of the priests into the Zadokites and the Levites. And while this is not terribly significant at this point, it's going to become very significant after the exile, because you end up with a kind of a civil war between two different groups of priests once Jerusalem is rebuilt. Now, the role of rabbis is a very questionable or interesting one because we really don't know how that whole role evolved. They probably started out as simple teachers within the community, and then they were given additional religious duties.
So Richard, could I ask a question about the priests?
Sure.
Were they backed by military powers, or how did one prevail against the other? Do you know?
Oh, the Zadokites and the Levites?
Yeah.
Well, apparently we'll go into this next week, but apparently the Zadokites, since they dominated the temple hierarchy, had the support of the Persian government. And so I don't know, I'm not sure what kind of a fighting war it turned into, but obviously there was a lot of bad feeling between the two different orders of priesthood.
Yeah.
So again, with the rabbis and the synagogue, we don't have an awful lot of evidence from the exile period, but it just sort of makes sense that they would have evolved as a local focus of religious life, since there was no temple, and the priests who were in Babylon really had nothing much to do at that point, since they were primarily just ritual and sacrificial officers. Now, the Sabbath is also undergoes some changes. From what we know about the Hebrews before the exile, the Sabbath was probably a monthly thing. It probably occurred on the first of each month. But during the exile period, this shifts very drastically into a weekly Sabbath. And we're not really sure if this was an adaptation to the Babylonian calendar, which was also a lunar calendar and apparently divided the month into the phases of the moon. But it appears that the official position on Sabbath goes from a monthly to a weekly observance during the exile and the period immediately after it. And I know somebody will say, well, what about, doesn't the creation say that the creation took place in 7 days? The interesting thing about that is that the creation story that we have in Genesis 1 was written 100 years after the exile. So it's very possible that the creation was kind of remolded in order to fit the Sabbath observation as it was then current.
Yeah, I think it's one of the last things written in the whole Hebrew Bible, Genesis 1 and 2.
I'm sorry, Pastor?
Genesis 1 and 2 are among the last things written in the Hebrew Bible, I think.
Right, yeah. Yeah, they're probably from maybe as late as the year 400 even. So anyway, the Sabbath, however, whether it be a weekly thing or a monthly thing, became a very definite mark of identification for the Jewish people. And so the Sabbath emerges as one of the the cardinal beliefs of Judaism. How important it was before the exile, we're really not sure. One, just a kind of a side note here, we have during the exile what looks to be the beginnings of sectarianism within Judaism. And by that I mean that there were certain groups, perhaps scribes, rabbis, intellectuals, who developed a kind of a special fondness for particular historical figures. So we think there probably were sects for Moses, David, Isaiah, Elijah, Noah, Enoch, Daniel, and an interesting one, Iphis. Iphis was the daughter of Jephthah in the book of Judges, and apparently she had a following that, again, it was kind of like the women's society, if you will. Unfortunately, it kind of gets messed up with the ISIS religion from Egypt at some point. And but anyway, these sects or sectarian movements seem to have persisted into Jesus' day. And I think one can make a fairly good case that John the Baptist was probably a member of an Elijah group, and I think Jesus very definitely seems to be part of the Isaiah group. These were not denominations or separate religions in any sense. They were merely what shall we say, groups that were influenced by the thinking and the memory of a particular leader. The later sects, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and so forth that are named by Josephus are much later development. That comes during the Greek and the Hasmonean period, right before the Roman period. We also know that that kind of sectarianism continued to develop, and most historians now would agree that in Jesus' time there were probably 40 or more different varieties of Judaism running around at that point. Not quite as bad as Protestant denominations, but not too far from it. Now, there are, I think, in this period of the exile, there are some very major developments which we have to somehow we have to come to grips that these are new developments, even though they may have had roots in the past. And these are the concepts of a Messiah, a final judgment, and a general resurrection. If you look in Hebrew religion certainly prior to the time of Josiah, you don't see much of this at all. But it becomes very prominent and increasingly so during the Persian period and the Greek period. A Messiah is a human leader who has been given cosmic powers, and very likely the Messiah grew out of veneration of particular heroes. However, the Messiah is always a forward-looking movement. It's not simply celebrating the deeds of leaders in the past. The Messiah takes on, in the various traditions, takes on various roles, such as to purify the temple, to expel foreign rulers, to gather all the faithful together back in Jerusalem, and to bring in a time of peace and justice. And the word literally means one who is anointed or has oil poured over them. And of course, the word Messiah in Hebrew then gets translated into Greek as Christos, which is where the word Christ, the name Christ, comes from. It appears that the Messiah had several different applications in Hebrew history or Jewish history, and the most notorious of those, I suppose, is Isaiah in the 44th chapter of his book, says that Cyrus, the emperor of the Persians and the Medes, is the Messiah of the Jews, which must have been a very shocking idea for many people at that time. Now, the general resurrection, as part of the judgment process, then goes along with the idea of the Messiah, and so the Messiah is to rule over the judgment and also to witness the general resurrection of all who have gone before, or who have died before. Now, one of the questions that historians always ask, in a rather troublesome way sometimes, is where did these ideas come from? And in the late 19th century and early 20th century, it was kind of common to say, well, these are ideas that the Jews picked up in Babylon. These were foreign ideas that got imported into the Jewish faith. The more we look at it, the less likely that In fact, the exponents of these ideas of the Messiah, resurrection, and judgment, who are basically the prophets, seem to be very hostile to Babylonian religion as a whole. And so it's unlikely that there would be that kind of influence. However, when you look at the different doctrines, if you will, there really is nothing in Babylonian religion that resembles the Messiah at all. Marduk can be considered a Messiah, but only for the gods. He has no interaction in terms of salvation for the common people. The idea of judgment occurs in Babylonian thought, but it's judgment of a city or judgment perhaps of an empire or of a particular king. Again, there's kind of no general application. Similarly, resurrection in Babylonian religion does occur. However, it is only gods and goddesses that are resurrected. And you do not have, as far as I can find, everything I've read, any reference to a general resurrection of the dead in Babylonian religion. So I think we have to assume that these are ideas, concepts, religious values that grew out of the Jewish faith at this particular time. Again, perhaps under the pressure of being in a foreign land and being cut off from a lot of their traditional expressions. Now, probably the best known story about resurrection and the Hebrew scripture is a kind of a long story, but I'm going to read it because it's a wonderful story, and it's very familiar, and you may catch yourself kind of singing along with it. But it's found in Ezekiel in the 37th chapter. And it reads this way: "The hand of the Lord was on me, and he brought me out by the Spirit of the Lord and set me in the middle of a valley. It was full of bones. He led me back and forth among them, and I saw a great many bones on the floor of the valley, bones that were very dry. He asked me, 'Son of man, can these bones live?' I said, 'Sovereign Lord, you alone know.' Then he said to me, 'Prophesy to these bones and say to them, Dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord.' So I prophesied as I was commanded. And I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them, but there was no breath in them. Then he said to me, 'Prophesy to the breath. Prophesy, Son of Man, and say to it, This is what the Sovereign Lord says. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain that they may live.' So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath entered them. They came to life and stood on their feet, a vast army. Then he said to me, 'Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. They say, our bones are dried up and our hope is gone. We are cut off. Therefore prophesy and say to them, This is what the Sovereign Lord says. My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord when I open your graves and bring you up from them. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done it, declares the Lord." I think we see in Ezekiel's passage resurrection and talking on two different levels. One certainly is referring to the exile very specifically, but also there is in it the radical notion that God is able indeed to raise the dead. And that becomes a standing belief, I would say, within Judaism from that time on. This is true, I think, of the Messianic belief of a resurrection, of the idea of a day of judgment. These continue into later centuries. Historians have guessed at this. We have no statistics, but that probably the Messianic hope was prevalent in Jesus' time, at least among 50% of the people. We know that the Pharisee movement, which later became really the source of most of the rabbis, the Pharisaic movement was split over the issue. There were Messianic Pharisees and there were non-Messianic Pharisees. And it is probably some of that conflict within the Pharisee community that we see reflected in the New Testament, where they are questioning Jesus about some of these things.
So, Richard, this is Monty again. That passage from Ezekiel is after the exile, but is that then 500 or 400 years before Christ, would you say?
Yeah, well, the exile ends at the end of the 6th century. So, it's 500 years until the birth of Jesus. It's a long time. A lot of things happen. Unfortunately, we don't know much about it. The records, other than the books of the Bible that were written during the Persian period, we have really no record of what happened to the Jewish faith during those years.
It gives you some perspective to compare it to the time today to Martin Luther. It's 500.
Yeah, it's about the same interval. And again, you have several changes of government. The Persians are replaced by the Greeks, and then the Greek Empire breaks down into several different kingdoms. First, Egypt rules over the Jews, and then the Seleucids. And then, of course, there is a movement for Jewish independence, which lasted about 100 years. And then again come the Romans. So you have one change of government after another, but it seems like the Jewish practice and Jewish beliefs remain fairly consistent, I think, based upon the experience of the exile, but also the restoration. And we'll talk next week about what the restoration looks like, whether that's a forward movement or a backward movement. I will mention that during the Persian and Greek periods, there is a development of something called apocalypticism, which grows out of prophecy and some of the messianic movements. But it's really something very quite different, and there does seem to be some Persian influence in apocalypticism. Now, needless to say, the institutions of Judaism, which persevered over those 500 years, were adopted by the Christians. And so the synagogue gets converted into the church, into congregations. The rabbi is replaced by pastors and deacons and bishops. The scribes become the church fathers, if you will, and the Torah then, of course, is modified and added to become our Bible. So there's a certain sense in which Christianity builds very dramatically upon the movements and the thoughts and the values that came out of the exile. Now, I want to mention one other thing that I think these doctrines of a Messiah, of resurrection, of judgment, do shift the ultimate shape of history. Arnold Toynbee used to say that his critics viewed history as just one damn thing after another. Whereas Toynbee thought that there were different patterns and motifs that you could discern in history, and in a sense, what these beliefs that come out of the exile do is say that there is an end point in history, what the Greeks would call a telos. That history does have meaning and it does move toward a certain point. We may not know what that point always is, and we may not know exactly how to calculate it, but there is a movement in history. It's not just one damn thing after another. Now, the final topic I want to talk about tonight is renewing the covenant. And for that, we're going to look at three prophets, and this is where I could go on for hours, but I'm not going to. There are three prophets that are predominant in this period. There may have been others, but we don't have any records of them. But the prophet is Isaiah, who is what we often call the second Isaiah, the prophet Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. They are roughly contemporary with one another, roughly because Jeremiah comes a little bit earlier. He actually knew the king Josiah. He apparently, during Jeremiah's time, the religious and political leaders within Jerusalem split into two camps, a pro-Egyptian and a pro-Babylonian camp. He was part of the pro-Babylonian camp, and so when the Babylonians finally conquer the city, they look fairly kindly upon him, and he is treated pretty well. He joins the governor that's been appointed to govern over this area in a little town outside of Jerusalem, and apparently spends a couple years there. Gedaliah, the governor, is assassinated, and this brings down the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar again. And what is left of Gedaliah's government decides to flee to Egypt. Which seems kind of odd when you think about it, but Jeremiah doesn't want to go to Egypt, but he is convinced that he has to join them. And so legend or tradition has it that Jeremiah dies in Egypt. Ezekiel is present at the siege of Jerusalem. And again, there is some lack of clarity here about exactly where all of Ezekiel's writings were written. It appears to be mostly from Babylon. There are some references to Jerusalem in his writings. And Isaiah is probably a little bit later than either of them. His writing is during the actual exile. There's a real problem in dating Isaiah, second Isaiah, because it was written in such a way as to kind of conceal the fact that it was not first Isaiah. And so there's not a lot of chronological clarity in the book of Isaiah. All three of these prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, were probably from the upper class. They were not royalty, which is probably a safe thing in those days, but they were probably descended from the hereditary priesthoods. And so they were probably all Zadokites, though we really don't know that. The three books of these prophets are a mix of genres. There are oracles, and there's narratives. And then in Jeremiah, there are also what we might call symbolic events, or certain demonstrations he makes that are to make a point. In Ezekiel, we also have a few visions. If you try to read any of these books from front to back, they are not very coherent. They're not chronological books at all. They jump from one thing to another, and then sometimes back to the same thing again. They show, all three books, but especially Ezekiel and Jeremiah, show signs of heavy editing, and probably after the period of the exile. Now, the books include three different kinds of oracles, and they're kind of similar in this respect. There are oracles denouncing the sins of the people, and the sins are idolatry, materialism, injustice, and the failure to keep the covenant. I want to point out one thing I just picked up in a book about Babylonian history, is that the Babylonian, and I assume the Hebrew concept of justice, was very clearly an economic issue. It had to do with how you treated the poor people. We see of justice as a far more extensive thing. But it was, at that time, it was primarily an economic item. Now, Ezekiel talks about the people of Israel, and this is the period leading up to the exile. There is a conspiracy of her princes within her, like a roaring lion tearing its prey. They devour people, take treasures and precious things, and make many widows within her. Her priests do violence to my law and proclaim my holy things. They do not distinguish between the holy and the common. They teach that there is no difference between the unclean and the clean, and they shut their eyes to the keeping of my Sabbath, so that I am profaned among them. Her officials within her are like wolves tearing their prey. They shed blood and kill people to make unjust gain. Her prophets whitewash these deeds for them by false visions and lying divinations. They say, this is what the sovereign Lord says when the Lord has not spoken. The people of the land practice extortion and commit robbery. They oppress the poor and needy and mistreat the foreigner, denying them justice. Fairly damning observation. And then Jeremiah, it talks about what happens during the destruction of Jerusalem. I looked at the earth, and it was formless and empty, and at the heavens, and their light was gone. I looked at the mountains, and they were quaking. All the hills were swaying. I looked, and there were no people. Every bird in the sky had flown away. I looked, and the fruitful land was a desert. All its towns lay in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. So these are oracles denouncing the Jewish people, denouncing the idolatry, denouncing the miscarriages of justice. There are also oracles that denounce neighboring countries, and quite a few of these, among all of these prophets. I'm not going to talk about those because they really don't fit into our story, but it does seem that they were kind of like denouncers of all peoples, the homeland, but also the foreign countries. Now, the new covenant, which emerges from the writings of these three prophets, I think can be distinguished by three factors, three distinguishing marks. One of them is that this covenant, unlike the old covenant, is a unilateral one. God makes it on behalf of himself to his people. It is not a give and take type of covenant like the old one. The other is that this covenant tends to be universal. It is not simply a covenant for one people, though that is where it begins, but it becomes a covenant for the entire world and the entire universe. The third thing I think that this covenant shows is if this is the right word, an investment in personal faith as opposed to corporate faith. I'll talk about that in a moment. In terms of the unilateral nature of the covenant, this is from the 11th chapter of Ezekiel. Therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I will gather you from the nations and bring you back from the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you back the land of Israel again. They will return to it and remove all its vile images and detestable idols. I will give them an undivided heart and a new spirit in them. I will remove from them their heart of stone and give them a heart of flesh. Then they will follow my decrees and be careful to keep my laws. They will be my people, and I will be their God. But as for those whose hearts are devoted to their vile images and detestable idols, I will bring down on their heads what they have done, declares the sovereign Lord. And then in probably the most well-known expression of the unilaterality, if you will, of the new covenant is from Jeremiah. The days are coming, this is Jeremiah 31st chapter. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. To look at the universality of the covenant, we have a very interesting passage in Isaiah. This is from the great 40th chapter, which is kind of like the apex of 2nd Isaiah. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground that he blows on them and they wither, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. Of whom will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name. Because of his great power and mighty strength, not one of them is missing. I think this is a conception of God that is, far beyond what we saw in Hebrew religion prior to the exile. Now, not only is it a kind of a unilateral covenant and one that is universal, but it also, I think, very importantly, is a personal covenant. And here we have the moving in Hebrew Jewish religion, I think, from the collective to the personal. If you look at earlier concepts in the Hebrew religion of salvation, that is a collective thing. It is the people who are saved, not individuals. The sacrifice is done on behalf of the people. Prayer is made by the people as a group. The works of charity are done either by the state in the name of the people or simply by the people themselves. So you may ask the question, wasn't there a personal element in Hebrew religion prior to this? What do you make of somebody like Abraham or Moses or David or Solomon or Samuel or Elijah? I think you have to compare or contrast. These are salvation heroes. These are the heroes of the faith as they are said to be in the book of Hebrews. The people are, by and large, anonymous. You don't see them, you don't hear them, except when they get into trouble, like making the golden calf. The idea of theophany, that God can appear, occurs only to the elite and the leadership. Isaiah begins his prophecy by saying he is not worthy to be one of those addressed by God. He is a man of unclean lips, and yet he becomes one of those heroes of faith. What you have then, I think, is, I hate to use this word, but I can't find any other good word for it, is a democratization of the Hebrew faith in Judaism. It's no longer simply a matter of ritual. It's no longer a matter of simply leadership, of kings, of priests. It becomes a religion of the people. And I think that is one reason, certainly, why Judaism is able to endure not only in those 500 years down to the time of Jesus, but after the destruction of the Second Temple and into the present time. So the implications of this new covenant are, we move from temple as the center of worship to Torah, to the Word of God as it is collected in a long process of editing and solidification. We move from ritual to righteousness. And so it is not so much the matter of the cultic observances as the way you treat each other and you treat other people. Now, I know the question has been raised, is this all that different from other religions of the period and of the area? And I think it is. I think Mesopotamian religion, well, it had a very definite side of ethics and morality to it, was based not so much on a religious covenant as it was on political structure. You have a movement then from the temple as a focus of worship to the synagogue. And again, as I said, that then continues into the congregation and the church in the Christian era. You have a movement of the center of religious activity, if not religious power at least, from the priest to the rabbi. I think you have a transition from the tribe, which is the people as a whole, to the family. And I think that trend occurs over and accentuates over many years. And then this last one may be considered a little bit of a surprise. And that is the Judaism becomes a missionary religion. I mean, we definitely don't think of Judaism today. You don't think of rabbis out on the street corner passing out leaflets. It's just not the way we think of Judaism. But the fact is that as a result, I think, of the renewal of the covenant, of many of these changes that took place during the exile, that Judaism does indeed become a missionary religion. And there have been some studies, not terribly conclusive, but suggestive, that perhaps in the period of the Roman control, before Jesus, Judaism was receiving about 20,000 converts a year, which is a considerable amount of growth. And that will have implications for the nature of Judaism as well. So the next step is a return from the exile, and what happens when you come back to Jerusalem. And it is a story one would think of great triumph and conquest, and it turns into a story of conflict and chaos, and perhaps in some ways religious retrogression, though that is controversial. So that's where we will turn next week. And I actually cut this down to 50 minutes. I can't believe it. So any comments or questions? And I'm losing my voice, so
yeah,
I think it's a good time for me to stop.
Well, thank you, Richard. That was great, this is Ken. Um, Couple of questions, I guess. One is you'd mentioned that they did not appear to make a temple one in Babylon, but the Egyptian Jews did. Is that just potentially the political difference between the rulers? I mean, maybe the Babylonians were tougher on this, or I mean, I always had the feeling that at least when the Persians came in, that they were a little more liberal on things.
Okay, I didn't catch all of that, Ken. I think the question is the Babylonian political ethics related more to their structure? Yeah, and I think it is. Political structure among the Jews and the Hebrews before the exile, it was a very fragile thing. You have only a couple kings that seem to keep things under control, and so I think the responsibility, if you will, of maintaining any kind of moral and ethical order probably fell upon the religious leaders, and for the most part they failed as well in Israel, as the prophets would tell us. Whereas I think in Babylon is, I've said the Babylonians and before them the Assyrians are obsessed with record keeping, but they're also obsessed with laws.
Yes.
And the laws, again, most of the laws have to do with dispensing justice, with negotiating between people who are arguing over things. Not a lot on criminal justice. That's pretty simple. You execute them. But
yeah.
Yeah.
And that remains true until not too long ago, actually, relatively.
Yeah. But Babylonian law is very early as codified. Hammurabi, of course, is the most famous, but he was actually the third to set up a series of laws like this. And it appears that some of these laws may have gone back as much as 2,500 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also said that you made the case for Judaism becoming doing more in terms of looking for converts, which is not, as you said, the way we view Judaism today. It's kind of we're a family and we're off doing our own thing here. I mean, that's the way they often come across. And so did they lose that, or am I misstating where they are today?
Well, why is Judaism not a missionary religion today?
Yeah.
I think two things. First of all, the failure of the two Jewish rebellions in the first and second century, but also the Christians are responsible for it. Mm-hmm. Jewish persecution, you can hardly find a decade in history from the second century onward to our time in which there was not active persecution of the Jews in some part of the world.
Mm-hmm. And clearly through the Middle Ages and even before, and when Christianity took over in Europe, and that there was always that persecution. Yeah,
and so I think it's very dangerous to be a missionary if you're in that kind of a environment.
Yeah.
But if you see, now there are lots of debates about how many Jews there were in the time of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And my best guess from what I've read, and looking at a half dozen different sources, is that it probably was about 2.5 million. Mm-hmm. One half of those people lived in what we call the Holy Land. The other half lived in Egypt and Turkey and Greece and Rome, maybe as far as Spain. how did they get there? Well, some of them were simply Jewish travelers. And merchants, and it seemed like almost every community in the Middle East had at least one Jewish doctor. They seem to literally have almost a hold on that profession. But it had to be that if there were 1.25 or 1.5 million adherents to Judaism outside of the Holy Land, a lot of them came through conversion.
Yeah, sort of what I thought, but I wanted to hear your thoughts on that. Well, I have nothing more.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at the time too.
Yeah, we're about at that time.
And so thank you, Richard, for yet another trip through history that helps to illuminate our own kind of Christian gospel of Jesus, and just the by contrast and by continuity, both.
And next time we have a different cast of characters. We're going to be looking at the third Isaiah, who comments on what's happening in Jerusalem, but also a couple prophets that we don't spend a lot of time with, Haggai and Zechariah, and also we'll take a look at the controversial figure of Ezra. So that's next week.
All right.
Thank you, Richard.